All right, let's dive into Old Wick Castle. This one's for you, actually. You requested it. And let me tell you, these sources we've got, Michael J. Gunn and Robert Wilson Richmond, they really get into it.
Oh, that's great. Always exciting to see some in-depth stuff.
Yeah, and some contradictions too. So we'll see if we can sort those out along the way.
It's part of the fun of history, right?
For sure. Okay, so picture this. Old Wick Castle, right on the edge of a cliff. North Sea, crashing below. Isolated, windswept. You know, the whole classic castle vibe. Richmond even calls it a comforting landmark for sailors, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
It's a ruin. Why would that be comforting?
Well, people do tend to personify these landmarks, especially the historic ones.
Right.
They become almost like figures watching over things. Those sailors using landmarks to navigate, maybe they saw this old man of Wick as a protector.
The Old Man of Wick. That's the nickname, right? Gunn said it was the fisherman back in the 18th century. You'd think with a name like Old Wick, it would be, well, old. But the Gaelic name is a bit different.
Yeah, Castile Altna Wick. It means Castle of the Burn of Wick. It wasn't actually in the town of Wick, which was north of the river. Old Wick Castle was south, so strategically placed, controlling that territory.
Strategy, which means power struggles. And Gunn lays out this whole line of owners, starting with William the Lion way back in the 12th century. Earls, Vikings, marriage alliances to prevent raids. It sounds like a whole drama.
And that's how you have to see it. A castle wasn't just a home back then. It was power, alliances, controlling vital land. These families weren't just, handing down property. They were shaping the politics of the region.
Wow. So after William the Lion, you've got the Chains, the Sutherlands. A lot of names. Gunn doesn't really dwell on it, but it sounds like this time period was anything but peaceful.
You're right. All those competing claims on the castle, feuds simmering, and eventually violence. It's a reminder that those quiet periods in history books, they're often full of tension, just waiting to explode.
And explode it did. When the Oliphants get the castle, things get interesting. Gunn mentions a siege in 1569 by the master of Caithness, a Sinclair. But get this. There's this story about Lord Oliphant out hunting one day, and he's ambushed. He's chased back to the castle and escapes by leaping across a chasm on horseback.
Wow.
I know. Now, whether that's completely true or embellished, who knows? But it definitely shows how dangerous those times were.
Yeah. These weren't just disagreements. It was life or death.
And it wasn't just a family squabble either. Gunn mentions the clan gun getting involved, sometimes on one side, sometimes the other, adds another layer to it, right?
For sure. And for listeners who might not know, the Scottish clans weren't just warriors. Complex social structures, their own hierarchies, loyalties, they're part of these conflicts shows how tangled things were.
Yeah.
Personal feuds connected to the whole region's politics.
So we've got this drama, power struggles, near-death escapes. What about the castle itself? Richmond really focuses on those defenses, ditches, gatehouses, even matriculation above, which sounds pretty intense.
It does. Shows how important Old Wick was, strategically. Not just for show, this is a fortress, built to last.
Sounds less like a home, more like a military base.
True, but Gunn does mention fireplaces. And maybe a chapel. So these castles had to be both, right? Fortress and home. Lords and their families, they needed some comfort, even with all that danger around. Those details, the fireplaces in the chapel, they tell us something, don't they? Even in a fortified place, people still wanted warmth. And religion mattered, even in that setting.
And Richmond describes all these buildings outside the keep, too. Barracks, a brew house, even a smithy, which I had to look that up.
Wow.
It's a blacksmith's workshop. You'd need someone to keep those weapons sharp, I guess.
Absolutely. A castle is more than just the building. It was a whole system. Soldiers, servants, craftsmen, all vital, like a little village, all centered around this point of power. And Richmond saying there were barracks outside the keep. That means a lot of men, dozens, maybe hundreds, all needing food, equipment.
So, if those walls could talk, imagine the stories. Feasts, plotting, births, deaths, all within that one place for centuries.
Amazing to think about. That's what makes these sites so captivating. It's not just dates and battles. It's real people, living, loving, fighting right there.
Speaking of fighting, what exactly is matriculation above? I know it's a defense thing, but for those of us who aren't, castle experts.
Right. Imagine you're attacking, climbing a wall, and suddenly rocks, maybe even boiling oil, are pouring down on your head. That's matriculations. Openings in the floor above, defenders could drop all sorts of nasty stuff on anyone below. Brutal, but effective.
Yikes. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be under one of those. Really gives you a sense of the times, though. Always on edge, never knowing when the next attack might come.
It's that paradox of castle life. You have this show of wealth, power, trying for comfort, but always that underlying awareness of danger. You had to be ready.
And speaking of that, let's go back to that Old Man of Wick name. We said sailors might have seen it as a protector, but what else does it say about how people viewed the castle?
I think it shows that these places, even in ruin, they hold power. They are part of the landscape, part of the stories people tell. Old Man implies wisdom, watchfulness, like it's still guarding the coast. Silent, but always there.
We've covered design, the people, the dangers, but before we get to the decline, remember those contradictions we mentioned?
Oh, you mean like how Richmond puts Sir Reginald de Cheyne at Old Wick in the 14th century, but Gunn says it went to the Earl of Sutherland when Cheyne died in 1345.
Exactly. It's like a historical mystery right there.
It really makes you wonder, and that's what I love about digging into history. Sometimes these little mysteries, they lead to something totally new. Maybe there's a document somewhere hidden in an archive, you know. That explains it all.
Or maybe it's just different ways of looking at it. Could the castle have been like co-owned or some weird arrangement when they were handing it off? It makes you want to go on a research trip yourself, you know?
Right. It never ends. We're always refining our understanding, questioning things. And sometimes the unanswered questions are the most interesting ones.
Wow, we've got a big one here. Why'd Old Wick get abandoned in the 18th century? Castles weren't as important for defense, right? Like warfare had changed.
Exactly. Gunpowder had changed everything by then. The old ways of defending weren't as useful. It became more about artillery, big armies.
But wouldn't a strong position still be good? Even with cannons, they still built forts for a long time after that.
That's true. And some castles, they were adapted, kept being used. But for Old Wick, the location, maybe that was a problem. Out on that headland, exposed. It'd be an easy target from the sea.
So it became outdated, like a relic almost. Kind of sad, in a way.
It is. But that decline, it also tells a story, doesn't it? Things becoming more peaceful, less need for those fortified homes. People could focus on other things. Shows how even the strongest structures, they can't fight time forever. The castle went quiet. All those people gone.
But here we are, centuries later, still fascinated by it. It's like the power of history, right? These places hold memories, stories, just waiting for us to find them.
Absolutely. That's the best part of studying history. The journey of discovery, piecing together the past, understanding how it affects us now, and maybe even using that knowledge to make better choices in the future.
So before we finish up, let's go back to the design. Try and picture life there. We talked about fireplaces, a chapel, but what about those barracks Richmond mentions? What does that tell us?
Well, it shows there's a whole community in those walls, not just the Lord and his family. Soldiers, servants, craftsmen, all kinds of people.
That's interesting. I never thought about how many people must have been there just to support the castle. Makes you think about how they all lived together. Did the soldiers, like, hang out with the Lord's family? Were there separate areas for everyone?
Those are great questions. The sources don't give us all the details, but we can guess based on what we know about medieval life. It was a strict system, obviously, the Lord on top, but people would have interacted. Servants taking care of the family, soldiers guarding the gates, and everyone together for big events, feasts, religious stuff.
So it wasn't just a military base, it was a whole town, almost. And speaking of communities, we can't forget the clan gun. They weren't just hired muscle, right?
No, not at all. The clans were more like extended families, I guess. A shared history, very strong sense of who they were. And they were a big part of Scottish politics and fighting back then.
And them being involved at Old Wick, it means those conflicts weren't just rich families fighting. It was whole groups of people with long histories in the area.
Right. It adds another layer to the story. Reminds us that history isn't just about the big names and battles. It's about everyone else, too. Their families, their communities, what they believed in.
And speaking of beliefs, what about that chapel Richmond mentions? What does that tell us about religion at Old Wick?
Well, having a chapel, it means religion was important to them. This was a time when faith was a big part of life. People looked to the church for guidance, comfort, especially when the world felt so uncertain.
So even in a place built for defense, they made room for something spiritual. Shows you that castles weren't just cold and harsh. They were homes, communities, places where people lived, loved, worshipped, and yes, sometimes fought and died.
Exactly. And by looking at those pieces of their lives, we can start to see the real story behind the stones.
Okay, I think we've got a good picture of life at Old Wick now, but I have to ask, what about those contradictions we keep finding? What happens when the historical record isn't clear or even disagreeing with itself. It can make things tricky. We want those nice, neat answers. But history, it's usually more complicated than that.
It is. It reminds us that history isn't just facts on a page. It's about how we interpret those facts. We're always looking at things in new ways, and those contradictions, well, sometimes they lead to the most exciting discoveries.
Yeah, it's like we're putting together a puzzle, but some pieces are missing. We got to use our imagination a
A
bit.
great way to put it. And, those missing pieces, they're part of what makes it interesting. They make us ask more questions, dig deeper.
Speaking of questions, there's one that I keep coming back to. What if these walls could talk? What would they tell us about all the people who are here at Old Wick?
That's a good one. Imagine those stones whispering stories about feasts and battles, love affairs, betrayals, births, deaths, all happening in those same rooms for hundreds of years.
Makes you realize how small our own lives are in the grand scheme of things.
It does.
What do you think was the most, dramatic event in Old Wick's history? Anything really stand out from the sources?
Well, Lord Oliphant's escape during that siege, that's got to be up there. Imagine him running for his life, knowing if they catch him, he's done for, and then jumping that chasm on horseback.
It's crazy. I wonder if the story got exaggerated over time. But either way, it adds some excitement, and it shows you, again, just how dangerous life could be back then.
Definitely. It reminds us that castles weren't just buildings. They were symbols
Yeah.
of power, sure, but also vulnerability. They offered safety, but they were targets too. Always that tension in medieval Scotland.
And still, people built communities, celebrated, worshipped. It says a lot about people, doesn't it? How resilient they are.
It does. Think of all the work that went into building these places, the detail, the skill. They wanted stability, beauty, something that would last, in a world that often felt, well, unpredictable.
So as we wrap up this dive into Old Wick Castle, what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away?
I hope they feel that sense of wonder, that they appreciate how complex history is, and maybe even want to learn more about Old Wick, the people who live there. Maybe even visit the site, stand in those ruins, let their imaginations go.
I like that. And remember, this is just the start. There's so much out there to discover. Books, articles, even online. Who knows, maybe you'll find some new clue, some piece of the puzzle that no one's seen before.
The possibilities are endless.
Well, to our listener, thanks for joining us on this trip to Old Wick Castle. We hope you enjoyed the deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep that sense of discovery alive.